of random.
Coming up on this week's episode of Hip Hop Now podcast, Kendrick Lamar is leaving TDE. Nori and Wu-Tang flunkies and 25 years of Outkast's AT aliens. I know you came here for the flunkies, but we're going to talk about it. Let's do it.
Let's get right to the business.
Read these headlines. This album must be gone. This album must be gone.
Come to hip hop podcast.
What up, y'all? I am your host, Vegas, and this is Hip Hop Now Podcast, a podcast designed to catch you up on all hip hop news, music, and culture that happened throughout the week. Return to listeners, what up? Appreciate you. New listeners, I'm glad you came through to hear what was going down here on Hip Hop Now Podcast. Extra big shout out to the producers of this podcast over at patreon.com/hip hop now. Those people get special extra treatment because they are making this podcast possible on a number of levels, from growing, right? From providing the funds for advertisement of this podcast via social media, also via equipment, right? Most of this equipment I bought myself, but they helped me to enhance what you hear and see over on the YouTube channel, the B-Roll Network. And if you're interested in checking out what a video version of this very podcast that you may have been listening to for years at this point, the link is in the description to this episode. It's a brand new thing I've been doing. I've been trying to do at least every week, or at least every time I do a Hip Hop Now podcast. And we kind of we finding the groove. And I want to shout out the people who came through on the YouTube channel to subscribe to the channel. So if you're watching on the channel right now, or you're listening on a podcast, subscribe. It's so much hip hop to talk about every day. The podcast makes itself. Big shout out to hiphopdx.com, allhiphop.com, djbooth.net, thesourcemagazine.com, and a couple of places where I'm getting some of these stories from. Let's get right into the business. So, I'm not even going to lie. I'm a fan of Drink Champs. I'm not going to pretend I'm not. I like the idea of, talking to the lesser known hip hop artists, the underground, the old school, whatever you may want to call it, giving out the flowers to the people who are less visible as a result of what hip hop does to MCs, excuse me, producers, whomever in hip hop. And I think it's great in a sense that we get to hear stories and learn about hip hop lore directly from those who were involved in it. There's so many stories and things and what ifs that get revealed in some of these interviews. Some myths get dispelled, some get confirmed. I think it's dope for that. Some people don't like Nori's style. That's cool. But you gotta understand, some of these people have been interviewed a dozen times, whether it be past or present. And there's something about being in that space with Nori that makes it easy for them to reveal some things that they hadn't talked about, at least not candidly before. So I think it's dope in that regard. But sometimes the candid can get out of control. So in a recent episode of Drink Champs, had Nori had guests like Mickey Fax and Astor Roth and somebody else. That's besides the point. The conversation went over into, or at least the mention of Wu Tang affiliates. Now, if you don't know what that means not the Wu Tang Clan members you know and are accustomed to, but those that are affiliated with Wu Tang Clan, like Killer Priest, Killer Army, Sons of Man, Shaheem, um, some other dude, I can't remember his name, Papa Wu. Like, they're not in the Wu Tang Clan group, but they are affiliated with them, right? And a number of these groups were spawned from the Wu Tang Clan tree in the 90s, around the time the Wu was hot. Well, Nori referred to Sons of Man, was also a Wu Tang affiliate group from the 90s, as flunkies. I look, I don't mean to laugh. I know some people love Sons of Man, but it was something that I expected from Nori, right? I expect that comedy, but I didn't expect him to be as dismissive of them as he was. Well, if you've been busy because you're an adult, or maybe your address is under a rock, but you're still a hip hop fan, and you come to Hip Hop Now podcast to find out, hip hop Twitter, hip hop social media went crazy. People did not like Nori referring to these acts as flunkies. They found it disrespectful. He was disrespectfully dismissive of their uh their contribution to hip hop, right? And in some ways I agree with them, and in some ways I don't. Now, I did a bonus episode for the Patreon supporters that not only I talk about this topic in depth, but I also talk about the notion of the affiliate, right? Because at the end of the day, Wu Tang affiliates aren't the only affiliates that have been kind of disrespected, whether they be nice or not. Most record labels have artists that are like plucked off a tree of a group or a movement or even a label. You know what I'm saying? And typically, it depends on the saturation of that vibe, right? Like there was a point where saying Bad Boy Records or putting Bad Boy on something didn't really mean much anymore. Same thing with Rough Riders. And sometimes it didn't mean much because it wasn't coming from the top tier artists who got the vibe going for these labels or these groups. And Wu Tang affiliates are no different. So it was an unfortunate situation, a situation that I believe is starting to get cleared up. Obviously, cats from Sons of Man had some stuff to say about it. Obviously, it's the Wu. They tend to stick together. So you had Shaheem and Killer Priest saying things about it. I don't think Nori is apologetic about referring to Sons of Man as flunkies, but probably more so dismissing Wu affiliates, knowing that people did rock with Killer Priest and at least Shaheem much harder than they rocked with the other groups I mentioned. Not to say that they don't have their fans, because they do. I'm just saying some of these affiliates were way bigger than others as far as fan base goes. So we'll see what happens. Supposedly, there's like a special drink champs coming out where they'll address it. And also, Nori, I think he's going to speak to Killer Priest on camera or something. He mentioned something about speaking to him. So that's neither here or there. But we shall see what happens. In other news, Flavor Flav, this is on hiphopdx.com. Flavor Flav said that Dr. Dre's upcoming album is getting ready to come out and he's on it. And there has been rumors that this Dr. Dre album that I said on this very podcast that I think Dre is working on a project. Plus, I know he's working on a project because he's getting divorced, and I knew an album was coming. But I specifically said Detox was coming. Now, every year, right, in January, I kind of started this official yet unofficial trend of making predictions for that year as far as hip hop goes, as far as hip hop releases go. And Detox has probably appeared on three, or maybe three episodes, because I always felt like that album will see the light of day. And I also said that Jay Electronica's solo album would see the light of day when a lot of people thought it wouldn't. And it did. And the thing is as much as Detox or Jay Electronica's debut album should have released when the timing was right, people still want to hear it. Whether they like the finished product or not, they still want to hear it. And something like Detox, where, some beats and songs from Detox have surfaced on other projects. So it's not going to be the album that seemed close to being released with those records on it. At least I don't think so. Not knowing Dre, it probably won't be that. Um, but nevertheless, it kind of feels like he's going to drop Detox, right? And maybe he's found a way to spin it, you know. So maybe it fits now, right? Maybe it's more pandemic based or themed. I don't know how you do that with chronic or whatever. Maybe you smoke chronic and whatever. But it really seems like Detox or just another Dr. Dre album is on the way. And part of the reason why I say that is because maybe some months back or a year back, I remember Dr. Dre was in the studio with damn near everybody from Death Row. And I kept thinking, I wonder if Dre is going to do an album that features a ton of people from Death Row, like a reunion. Or I wonder if Dre's going to do, Stranded on Death Row Part 2, and maybe that can anchor Detox. And probably the inspiration, right, was probably uh, Nas King's Disease having a firm reunion that included Core Mega. You know what I'm saying? Because it really, when that song was on it, like people liked the King's Disease album, but just to have a song that kind of had the firm reunion on there with Dr. Dre talking at the end, even though I thought it was nature at first. Um, that was a dope moment for hip hop. And who knows what it did for streaming, right? Some people probably went back and was like, yo, this firm album wasn't that bad. But I could see Dr. Dre really jumping in that death row bag, at least for that song. But all signs point to a new album. Whether that album is Detox remains to be seen. Who knows? I don't know. If you know, you tell us. Whatever. But it's interesting, nevertheless, to just to see that this is a possibility for Detox to drop in 2021, and it probably dropped before Kanye's album Donda. And let me address that real quick. So Kanye West did another listening party, right, in Chicago this time for this Donda album that we were told was definitely dropping this past Friday. If you're from the future, you know what to do. You need to get your ass out of here. But it never dropped. I heard the leak. I talked about it on the last episode of Hip Hop Now podcast. But now I'm at the point where I don't even care. When the album comes out, I'm not going to listen to it. What I heard from the leak, all these antics for an album that honestly is just not that good to me. I don't see it being that different. Maybe less songs, maybe better mixes of songs. everything wasn't trash, but Kanye's situation as a music fan, as a fan of his music, it's just a turnoff. It's just way too many people who got doper albums out now. You know what I'm saying? That you could go and listen to now. There's stuff that's anticipated that will probably be better. Like Kendrick Lamar, who recently on social media posted a message explaining, for one, that his album is on the way. So now we know why it's delayed, bars. But also that he would be producing the album, which scares me, but he's always different with how he does things. So maybe it'd be dope. But also that this would be his last album on Top Dog Entertainment, TDE, which is, I don't know, which is sort of good for him, possibly bad for TDE. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a fan of a ton of artists on the TDE label, but Kendrick Lamar is the flagpole. He's the what do you call it? The landmark of TDE. He's the backbone in a lot of ways. It's like you get that Kendrick release, and then everything else is an add-on to that. Not that a label has to have a leader, but typically there is a leader. And I don't think, well, in hip hop, typically there's a leader. There are other labels who have mega stars on their same roster, and no one is the leader of the label. But when it comes to hip hop, especially when you think about, like, let's say Bad Boy Records, right? Biggie was the considered the leader, right? He was the biggest star that drove the rest of the music, right? Even though we loved some of the other artists on there, Biggie was the cornerstone. Rockefeller, Jay-Z was the cornerstone, right? Rough Riders, DMX was the cornerstone of Rough Riders. And you can go on and on and on. Now, Def Jam throughout the years have had different cornerstones of their label, but they've had multiple megastars. As far as hip hop goes, I feel like I still love Schoolboy Q. You know what I'm saying? SZA's dope. There's a number of dope artists on there, but Kendrick is it. And for him to leave after this, I mean, it's dope that this being what, his fifth album with TDE, I think it's fine, right? Because at least they get an album that could be the turning point, either in his career or TDE in general, right? Could be his biggest, could be a flop, whatever it may be. But it does make me curious about, for one, what he has to say on the album, right? Like, will he address the situation? Um, I know that a lot of artists in general sign deals that are always good for them because they just want to get on and make music. And that's everybody. Some artists sign deals and have a clause for, if I go platinum, we get to renegotiate, right? And sometimes you don't hear about those renegotiations. They just happen. And maybe that renegotiation, the money doesn't work out, and the number of albums the label wants doesn't work out. And what happens? You go off and do your own thing. Now, Kendrick, I believe, is going to have his own label, which is also something that's not, foreign. This was something that Biggie was already planning, right? Him and Un were already working to establish their own stable that would include Junior Mafia, Lil Kim, um, C's, Lil C's, Cameron, probably Charlie Baltimore. You know what I'm saying? Eventually, maybe Biggie. Biggie leaves Def Bad Boy. Tupac wanted to leave Death Row. That was the thought because it was always a situation where they're the cornerstones of what they're doing. Like Tupac was became the as soon as Tupac landed on Death Row, he became the cornerstone over Snoop, which is crazy. But why wouldn't they leave to go off and to make more money for one? It's like a pyramid scheme. You know what I'm saying? Not maybe scheme is a rough word to use, but it's sort of like that, right? It's like, okay, I'm Biggie, I signed with Puff, right? We're making great music, but he making most of the money. I'm making some money, but I ain't making his money, and he's making it off the strength of me. And everybody knows what I bring to these beats is what makes us the money, not the production, not not Diddy saying take that, take that. Nothing. Biggie does. So why don't I take that image and that charisma and that fan base over to my own projects so I could profit and so on and so forth from the people I sign. I mean, it happens all the time. But in the case of Kendrick Lamar, it's interesting, you know. It's an interesting situation, and it makes me wonder where this album is going to go creatively, right? Because when you think about Kendrick Lamar's projects from Section 80 to Good Kid, Mad City to Pimp a Butterfly to Damn, even though those four projects don't sound identical, right? They're all different. Kendrick is a dude that's really inspired by art. You could tell he is particular about how he creates his music. He's particular about the words he uses, how he uses them, the different inflections in his voice. And when you've already done that four times, three times highly successfully, you don't really want to repeat. Now, I did hear a rumor that Damn wasn't exactly the type of album Kendrick wanted to make. But when you think about it, even though I like Damn, it kind of makes sense because coming Good Kid Mad City is one vibe that you kind of expect, right? It's a debut. Honestly, it's like Kendrick's version of his version of Illmatic, basically, right? A perfect introduction to who he is as an artist, as an MC. But To Pimp a Butterfly was like musical growth, right? His flows varied, the production varied, his collaborators varied. There was a lot of mixing of genres of music and music history all within this one album. It was extremely conscious also. And Damn felt like not a step back in a bad way, but not an evolution from To Pimp a Butterfly. When I reviewed it for this one website I used to write for, I felt like it was somewhat of a blend of Good Kid, Mad City and To Pimp a Butterfly. But in hindsight, and having listened to it recently, it's it's more so radio friendly track. It's more radio friendly tracks on there. It's less conscious than the last album, but I still liked it a lot. So it's interesting to see this situation and to wonder, or at least speculate, where things are going to go. Because at this point, the dude hasn't missed when it comes to making either dope album or classic, if you want to call it that. You can call it that. I won't call it that. Maybe I'll call Good Kid, Mad City classic. Who knows? I might even call it the Pimp a Butterfly classic. But basically, he's had four straight projects that are good, if not excellent. And I know the pressure has to be crazy. The pressure has to be even crazier with this being your last album. But I think he might have something. The only thing that scares me is the fact that he's going to produce it all. I'm pretty sure he's produced some stuff, before for himself. I don't know about a whole album. I'm just keeping it a buck. I don't know about a whole album. And lastly, uh, so 2021 marks the 25th anniversary of Outkast's sophomore album, AT Aliens. Actually, it was released. Let me see. This is on hiphopdx.com. It debuted at number 2 on the Billboard 200 chart upon release in 1996, selling over 350,000 copies in its first week. Um, and it was released on August 27th. I believe that was the date. I just wanted to talk real quick about that album. Um, I was more of a, I don't want to say a late bloomer. Hold on, let's take a drink break. Not necessarily a late bloomer when it came to Outkast, right? I was up on Southern Playalistic and Players Ball, Get Out and Get Something, Get Up and Get Out, Get Something. Like I was all into that. But back then, brother didn't have a lot of money. So I had to choose wisely when I was buying an album. And sometimes there were albums I just couldn't get. Outkast was one of them I wanted to get, but I also had this thing where if an album had been out for a while and I didn't have it and a new one was on the way, I typically didn't buy the album I originally wanted. I would just buy whatever was new. So when AT Aliens came out in 1996, and 1996 is such a dope year for hip hop that I think it's kind of slept on when people talk about dope years in hip hop. But this was the turning point to me in Outkast's career where they became the group you know today. See, Southern Playalistic Cadillac Funky Music was basically typical of what people, at least not from the South, anticipated from Southern rappers, right? Gonna talk that pimp stuff. You're gonna talk about Cadillacs. You know what I'm saying? Like it fit the mold of what people expectations were for Southern hip hop. AT Aliens was different. Once elevators, that music was different. When you saw the video, it was like, oh, this not the same group. It's kind of on par, but not so much, right? Because in a lot of ways, it's on par with Mobb Deep's transition from their first album, Juvenile Hell, because that's their first album, to the Infamous. But the difference is Juvenile Hell wasn't really a great album. So most people don't even talk about it or know that it's Mobb Deep's first album. Whereas Southern Playalistic Cadillac Funky Music, a lot of people like it, including myself. But AT Aliens was when Three Stacks became Three Stacks, right? He started dressing like like a genie, right? Big Boy started leaning into the pimp stuff, and that combination of those two personalities and persona, and then the music that was like a gumbo of funkiness, of energy in a lot of ways, of conscious lyrics, of you know, in some ways, gangster reality raps. It really separated them. They really became their namesake, which is Outkast. Their whole situation was like, we're outcasts in this industry. But I don't think the first album reflected that. Because, like I said, it was something you can expect from a Southern group, or you expected from a Southern group. It didn't stand out. It was one in many, even though it was dope. AT Aliens is when they stood out. And in a lot of ways, they don't get their flowers in the way they should because, uh, especially like Three Stacks with his style of dress, his lyricism. Same thing with Big Boy. Them as a collective, like they birth a lot of the creativity a lot of artists have today. Obviously, there's a ton of people who influenced some of these younger artists, but Outkast did that, and AT Aliens is a extremely dope album. Now, Aquemini is my favorite, right? Because I feel like Aquemini is like peak to me. It's like peak Outkast, right? But AT Aliens was such a dope album, released at a time where the competition was thick and it was different. It was, if you're tired of hearing East versus West, what I'm saying, New York, Cali, kind of with the same vibe in their music, even though it was all dope. Outkast literally stood out with AT Aliens. They made you pay attention, right? I mean, the fact that Andre 3000 said the South got something to say was like a cryptic message for what would happen from Outkast. And it was such a dope experience because, again, I liked Outkast on their first album, but I be honest, I wasn't checking for a second album. Not because I didn't like them, I just wasn't. There was so much going on in hip hop that all of our attention was somewhere else. But then when they dropped Elevators, and I didn't hear Elevators first, I saw the video first, and I didn't know what it was. And I looked at the name multiple times, like Outkast. Is this the same dudes? And when like once that video was over, I was like, that was different. And then when you saw the album cover with the comic book, it was just different. It was just dope. So if you haven't, go back, listen to Outkast's AT Aliens. They've been kind of doing like a whole anniversary rollout from animated videos of songs like Two Dope Boys to, I believe, like an extended version of the album, um, which features some bonuses. I'm pretty sure they probably touched up, remastered the audio. Very dope album to go back to and check out, man. Salute to them. 25 years of a great album. That's going to do it for me for this week. You can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Clubhouse, TikTok, whatever, at Vegas World INC. You can check out the video version of this episode of Hip Hop Now podcast on the B-Roll Network. The link is in the description of this episode. And please know, if you say, hey, audio podcast is where it's at, this podcast is available wherever you listen to podcasts. The link is also in the description of this episode. Until next time, y'all, I am not a critic. I'm a fan. Peace.
Drop it on the random.